Welcome back to the garage. As you would have seen from that little intro montage, I now have an engine. This isn't the BMW K1300 that I had originally said in the first video. This is actually a Honda CBR1100XX, also known as the Super Blackbird. This, I think, is a much more suitable engine for my application because it's not shaft drive and it rotates the correct direction. This is a chain drive bike, and I've already got a sprocket adapter to a flange for a drive shaft. And as you would have seen from the montage, I've spent some time getting it in position, a few little brackets removed from the chassis, but on the whole there's plenty of space to work with. I bought some materials to get the engine mounted. I've got some 1-inch 3mm wall tubing and some 4mm steel plate, which is going to be plenty to hold this lump in place and really give a nice solid mounting. But first things first, there's some rust on the chassis that I really need to tackle, and then I'm going to work my way along the chassis, cleaning up and getting ready to start working on some engine mounts.
I've been dreaming on in my head like a dream, a life worth living, a life worth dreaming. I'll do what I love till my heart stops beating. I'm feeding this demon. Got a taste, can't erase bitterness in my face. Work a job every day till your dreams fade away. Like a card, never change. Play the game, now we say I need a break. I'm staying strong, need to move on to be what I want. I'll keep dreaming on. I'm staying strong, need to move on to be what I want. I'll keep dreaming on. Face on when I chase like that, yeah, I play so strong with a knife in the back. I'ma swing home run like a baseball bat. Gonna see me rise, you can hate on that. I don't play both sides, doing me no cap. I'ma ride or die for my dreams on tap. I'ma fly real high, you ain't see me slack. No, it's not how you fall, it's how you get right back up. That's how you get tough. Calluses on my hands so rough, yeah, I call your bluff. I'm not the one, mess with me, come down with none. Cause I'm so done, you had your fun. And now you're gonna face down the barrel of the gun. Cause I got a full clip with your name on it. But I'ma let you try cause you ain't worth it. Time staying strong, need to move on to be what I want. I'll keep dreaming on. Time staying strong, need to move on to be what I want. I'll keep dreaming on.
So the rear of the chassis is now nicely cleaned up and painted in red oxide primer. I had 2 sections of rust repairs to do on both the chassis legs on the top and on the sides, and while I had the top off, I've cleaned up, treated the rust and painted inside as much as I can. I've removed all the bracketry from both the cross members and the rear of the chassis legs, all the way up to the front spring hanger mounts under this cross member. Now this cross member had a gearbox mount on the front, which I had to cut off earlier in the video to give enough space for the engine. Now my concern is around the output shaft here and the flange for my prop shaft clearance for this. Now obviously the further forward I have this, the less movement there is going to be on the prop shaft on this end, and it's still probably not going to be a significant amount because we're only talking really a few inches of travel on the rear end. So that prop shaft is not going to come up and down very much at all. However, I don't like the way this is sitting. I think what I'm going to try and do, cut it at either end and just rotate it so this the curve in it is actually upwards giving us just some extra clearance, and actually it might play nicely into helping mount the engine with it a little bit higher. So that's what I'm going to do, but before I cut any of that off, I'm going to cross brace the chassis legs to make sure when I cut this we don't have any movement. So I'm just replacing that temporarily with some of this 1-inch 3mm wall tube I bought, which is obviously the same as, but it was slightly heavier gauge than this crossmember, and I'll weld that in probably around there, maybe underneath the chassis, just to give it a really good holding point for when I cut. So I've played around with a few different configurations of this old gearbox crossmember that curved around here. It's over in the scrap pile now. I'm not going to use it, and I don't think I want to. Instead, what I'm going to do is replicate this crossmember we've got over here, which is the same diameter tubing as this. This brace here will effectively go slightly further along the chassis leg, closer to this original mount, but through the chassis leg, like these original ones do, on some plates. I'm going to make out of this 4mm steel here, plates to go on either side of the chassis leg, and drill a hole all the way through so that I can slide this 1-inch tube, or some of the other ones I've got, all the way through, and weld it up and brace just the front side of, or the rear side of these plates. I'm going to remove all of that and weld some reinforcement in through all that rusty area. Then, using the same 1-inch 3mm wall tube, I'm going to cross brace up to this crossmember here. So it'll be an X-frame effectively, and if I'm feeling really fancy, I can gusset it in the middle, but it won't be required given the thickness of this tube and the kind of dimensions we're working with. What that will leave is a nice triangular hole for the struts to go through. If I choose to front mount them, I may rear mount them, but we'll decide later. So that's the next thing, cleaning up these bits of the chassis leg here, making a couple of plates, and then drilling through and getting a tube mounted through here. Then I can remove this one and do some X cross bracing, or I may even do it with this still in place, but we'll see. Right, so a good bit of progress. I've got holes drilled through the chassis legs, and this 1-inch tube goes through, and as you can see, I've also cut these plates which will weld to the chassis, and then the tube will weld to the plates. There's a little bit of wiggle room, so I can make sure it all gets aligned nicely, but that will give us a really nice solid connection into the chassis legs either side, and then once that's in position and welded on the insides, it's just a case of cutting it to length, another plate round here welded to the chassis, and then weld the tube to the plate, and I'd like to cap them off. I don't really like open ends. It's just water can get in there and rust. Not that that's too much of an issue with this thick wall tube, but you know, over the long term, it's good to keep it nice and sealed. So that's really good progress. There's not a lot I can do right now. It's getting late and dark, but before I can start welding the new crossmember in place, I've got to deal with this really nasty section here, on the inside of the both. That's the kind of the key structural supports of the original configuration. This crossmember holds the gearbox, it holds the main suspension components mounted underneath there, the front of the leaf springs, so should be a really solid point, and as you can see on this side, it's really not. So this would have not been a good thing to just put back on the road at all, so I'm really glad I've caught that. And so yeah, the plates fit nicely either side. We've got some wiggle room so I can get it level, and then it'll be diagonal braces to either side of this cross member for an X brace. It doesn't actually get us that much more clearance. It gives a lot more space around the engine, which I like, for mounting things like radiators and oil coolers and other things like that, turbos. So it's good from that perspective. It gives us maybe another inch of clearance, but actually we probably lose that because we are further back, and so the prop shaft is going to swing on a larger arc back here. But I don't think it's going to be a problem. Just drop the camera there. If it is, I can always fabricate some sort of hoop in this tube at a later stage. A lot of this is going to be trial and error. I don't know quite how it's going to sit just yet, but there should be enough clearance. Fingers crossed. And the engine obviously isn't in its final position. The chassis is not perfectly level or at ride height, so there's a lot of variables in place, but I'm going to go ahead with this cross brace, get some strength back in there before I mount the engine and work on that side of stuff. Well, this is probably a good point to end this video. I have spent a good deal of time yesterday repairing the chassis legs and welding in my replacement cross members and bracing that across to one of the rear cross members. I haven't yet done the second diagonal to make the cross because I'm a little bit concerned about clearance for my suspension, and I think the best thing to do is get the engine in situ in this lovely large gap I now have, and start working through the mounts for that, get the pinion angle set, and then I can start looking at the rear end. This is probably actually strong enough as it is in terms of bracing the chassis legs. The loads, the twisting loads that this kind of X brace would counter are probably not going to be as significant as I may think, but we will see. If needs be, and if I feel like it at the end, I can obviously put the X in and gusset it, and it will look really smart and be fairly strong. But I think for now this should be good. Obviously the original cross member was a bit stout, a kind of larger diameter across between the two legs, but wasn't triangulated or braced in any other way other than to the gearbox. So that is where we're at. Hopefully for the next video I would have cleaned up the rest of the chassis legs and start thinking about mounting the motor and getting that all prepared. There'll be quite a bit to do with the engine. I've purchased this baffle plate to go in the sump, help with oil surge and starvation and things like that, and I'll also look into removing the balance shafts and blocking up the oil ports for the balance shafts to make sure we get plenty of oil pressure. But all of that to come in the next video. Thanks for watching.